We shall turn tonight to the story of Noah as recounted for us in the book of Genesis. This book consists of a series of histories, Adam and Noah, and then Abraham and Jacob and Joseph. And the story of Noah begins really at verse 9 of chapter 6 in Genesis, and it runs through 4 chapters to the end of chapter 9. And it's linked up inextricably with the story of the flood and the story of the ark. And it's a story which has really 2 great movements. 2 chapters are concerned with the actual build-up to the flood and the launching of the ark. And then the last 2 chapters to the denouement, we go up one side of the mountain and then down the other in a very symmetrical way. And like the whole book of Genesis, the story is brilliantly told and very carefully crafted. Within these 2 movements, up and down, we have perhaps 3 underlying themes. One of them is the depravity of man. The whole earth is filled with violence. And the other theme is God's salvation of the human race through Noah. And then thirdly, the recommissioning of man after the flood. So let's pick it up at Genesis 6:9. This is the account, or this is the history of Noah. And at some levels, I did want to focus on this personality and to avoid becoming immersed in the details of the flood and the architecture of the ark. Nevertheless, in a very curious way, Noah plays a very minimal role in the story. And in that respect, contrasts, I'm told, with other flood epics which are to be found in other Near Eastern traditions, and which to an extent overlap with the Genesis narrative, and which therefore indicate that there was a common tradition among all these Near Eastern peoples of this awful catastrophe. But in all the non-biblical narratives, there is a hero, somebody who by his own efforts and activities does so much to save himself and his family. And this person is very active, very dynamic, always doing things. And we also tend to have accounts in these narratives of the feelings of the hero and his reflections as he performed those various actions. Now, in the biblical story, really, Noah doesn't do a great deal. We know that he built the ark, but we're only told that. We don't have a blow-by-blow account of how exactly he did it. We're simply told that he did it. And we aren't told that Noah went to collect the animals. This is often a great puzzle to people, how Noah went to both poles on the equator to gather all the animals in. But in the Genesis account, the animals come to the ark, whether from the locality of the Near East or from further afield. Is not specified within the narrative itself. But Noah wasn't a collector of those animals. They came, and we're not told how he navigated or steered or looked after the animals. He's simply there. And in many ways, the emphasis falls more on the activity of God himself. And the concern of the story really is not to write a biography of Noah, but to underline certain key aspects of the character of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And he stands forth in this story as a God of omnipotence, of omnipotent holiness, who by his own word can bring destruction on the whole of this planet by opening up the deeps and by causing rain to fall from heaven, simply by his own omnipotence. And in the same way, at the end of 120 days, the same God can command the rain to cease. He can command the deep to stop casting up its tremendous volumes of water, and it can command a wind which evaporates the rain and the flood subsides. And here is a God who is in total control. In those other Near Eastern mythologies, these things are done by a whole army of deities. But in Genesis, it's all done by one God. And it's done by this God on the basis of rectitude and on the basis of morality, not because of some whim or because he's had his feelings hurt, but because God has seen that the earth was corrupt and it was full of violence, and God saw how corrupt the earth had become. And so this is a judicial response. It is not a response in pique or in personal anger or bad temper or irritability. It is the Lord God omnipotent in the exercise of his justice, excising this corrupt and violent race from the face of the earth. And that's the main point of the story, this omnipotent holiness of God. And along with that also the emphasis on God's saving activity. How amid all the chaos and all the upheaval of these tremendous events, God is still able to ensure the salvation of a nuclear human family and of all the species necessary for the survival of the earth's ecosystem. And God can do that using this frail craft, the ark. Now, I don't intend to say much about the ark because in the narrative we don't have very much information actually. It may at one level seem very full, but if you see from verse 14, the description of the ark itself doesn't tell us a great deal. And in fact, I would defy anyone to go and build on the basis of those specifications. We're told, go make an ark of cypress wood or gopher wood. We don't know what kind of wood that was. We're told to make rooms in it, not a many or how. And we're told to coat it with pitch inside and out. And this is how you're to build. The ark is to be 450 feet long and 75 feet wide and 40 feet high. Now, that is gigantic by the proportions of the ancient world. We know something of ancient Egyptian ships, and they'd be something like 180 feet long, the largest one. But here it's a huge thing. And of course, it isn't a ship, it's a box. It doesn't have a rudder. There is no way that it can control this huge and clumsy construction. Now, there is no plan given, there are no quantity surveyor specifications, there are no schedules, there's no architectural guidance at all. You couldn't build a house by being told, build it of this, put rooms in it, and make it this long and this high, and that's it. So the details are minimal. Now, attempts have been made on the basis of the specifications here to go to build something that corresponds to the detail, but it is really very speculative just how the ark was constructed, because it doesn't really matter. Noah's role wasn't all that important. Noah didn't save the world, and Noah's day-to-day involvement in this act of naval construction wasn't hugely important. So it's about God, God's omnipotence, God's plan of salvation, and it ends, of course, with God's covenant made with man way back in Genesis 9. Now, as I said, it occupies substantially 4 chapters, and all I can do is look at some of the key features of the narrative and do so fairly rapidly. First of all, if we look at verse 9 itself, the description of Noah simply as a man. He was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God, and he had 3 sons. And it isn't a great deal. And at the end of the story, we still don't know a great deal about Noah. His personality is very much masked and marginalized in this account. But we are told that he was a righteous man. That is, he was in the right with God. And it may be that, like Abraham, he was righteous because he had faith in God and believed in the promises of God and thrust himself on the mercy of God. We know that he wasn't a perfect man because we know at the end of the story that he makes himself drunk. And you can't say that that was a mistake based on ignorance, because at the time of the flood he was 600 years old and he had lived in a civilization where, beyond doubt, winemaking was a well-practiced skill. And so it was no accident that this happened to this good man. Now, the Bible is quite non-judgmental on Noah at that point. It's judgmental upon one of his sons. But Noah himself, it is simply recorded that he committed this momentary act of folly. But he was righteous, but he was not perfect, and he was not right on the basis of his own perfect and defensible lifestyle. But he was somebody, no doubt, who trusted himself to the mercy of God. He was also righteous in the sense that being in the right with God, he was a man who did everything just as God commanded. And we see that in verse 22 of chapter 6, and again verse 5 of chapter 7. Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. And there is an interesting parallel there, two interesting parallels. One with Old Testament Israel, who are redeemed from the bondage of Egypt on the basis of divine mercy, and who then, being redeemed, are given 10 commandments with which they are bound to comply. And they weren't redeemed because they had kept the commandments, but they kept the commandments because they had been redeemed. And in the same way, Noah, being a righteous man, justified before God, as John has been describing in his prayer, then this righteous man, he does all that God commands him. He kept the terms of his covenant with God. And that's the way it is with ourselves as believers. We are not justified or put in the right with God or adopted as God's children on the basis of obedience. But once we are adopted into God's family, we obey God, we keep God's covenant, not perfectly, but yet we practice what the Shorter Catechism called a new obedience. The phrase in Romans 1 is, there is an obedience of faith. The believer is justified as an ungodly man by God's grace. But that justified person then practices the obedience of faith. And Noah here, he is a righteous man, in the right with God, and then this righteous man did everything just as God commanded him. Now, specifically that means that he complied with all the instructions that God gave him anent the construction of the ark. And he must have been told far more by God than is recorded for us here, because we couldn't get very far. The best carpenter couldn't get very far with this kind of specification. Now, I'm reluctant to spiritualize this Noah's compliance with God's instructions. We know that Moses also, when he built the Ark of the Covenant, that Moses also complied in minute detail with the divine specifications. And curiously enough, the word for the Ark of the Covenant is not the same word as we have here for Noah's Ark, but it is the same word as we have for the ark in which the baby Moses was kept when his mother put him in the river. He was put in this kind of vessel as well. So it's a very general term. It can extend to this massive wood, this box 450 feet long, or to a Moses cradle for a tiny baby, the same word. But I suppose that the general principle is clear, that the believers and the church get their standing, their orders from God, the rules of engagement from God, and we have no right to deviate from those rules. Now, they were very detailed in Noah's case. God has given us too specifications as to how to live the Christian life, the Ten Commandments. He's given the church a commission to evangelize the world, to bring the gospel to every creature, and it is incumbent upon us to do everything just as God commands us. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. The next point I want to look at may strike you as rather odd. We find it in verse 16. Then the Lord shut him in. All these animals had come to Noah. There was an assortment of clean animals and of unclean animals, 7 pairs, 7 clean ones and 2 unclean ones. And they all entered the ark on that very day, verse 13. Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark, verse 13. A very interesting picture of the typical Near Eastern family, which is not like our nuclear family of father, mother, and 2.5 kids. But here we have instead Noah and his wife and their sons and the sons' wives. These are the family. Now, it would be quite absurd to argue from that's how we should all live. So sometimes you can't make biblical, incidental biblical details a ground plan for individual and community living. But then they were all in, you see, and then the Lord shut them in. Now, I have a problem with claustrophobia, and some of you have a problem with that as well. And I don't want this to worry no one in case Saddam Hussein wins the war and decides that he's going to torture me and just put me in some box or other and shut the door. So you keep that to yourselves. But it's really quite something, this. Here is Noah, and he's shut into this box. And you have to remember that he's in the middle here of the most colossal geological upheavals. Now, I don't believe that the flood itself explains the geophysical features that geology explores. The flood, in my view, can't explain the strata, and it can't explain the fossils, and it can't explain the lochs of Malig and Morar. It can't explain these things. But nevertheless, it was a geophysical event of just gargantuan proportions, because it had to generate in this short space of about 40 days sufficient water to cover Mount Ararat, which, if I can just recall quickly, is around 13,000 to 16,000 feet. And so really, this wasn't just some thunderclap or a heavy shower of rain. It wasn't a rainstorm. It wasn't just some typhoon or twister in Florida. Everything was absolute chaos. It was lashing down, it was bursting up from the deep, and it was rising not to a depth of 6 feet, but to a depth of something like 16,000 feet, and at a phenomenal rate. And there is this man shut into this box. And there's no comment on it. The whole story is so objective as to how Noah felt is not recorded. You can imagine today, when this was over, a BBC microphone. How did you feel, Noah? Well, there's nothing of that here. He was in that box. And we know that he had food, and he had companionship, and we know that he had some light, and he also had some ventilation. So at some levels he was safe enough. But he had absolutely no control over the box. And this must have been the mommy and daddy of all hurricanes. The deep must have been absolutely heaving with what was going on because of the convulsions, the volume of the water, getting round all those mountain ranges, bringing all those troughs and so on. So there he was, this poor man shut in. Now, it must have been at a human level a terrifying experience. And I suppose at one level I'm saying that, yes, this man was saved. And he was saved by grace. And he was saved in a remarkable and triumphant way. But, there was a cost to his discipleship. We see that way back there he was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. Around him was moral corruption and violence and all kinds of iniquity and criminality. And there he was, standing out. That was part of the cost of his discipleship. And in a world that was full of ungodliness and of anti-godliness, he was walking with God, and there was cost there too. So now he had been righteous, he had been blameless, and he had walked with God and paid all the cost of that. And now here he is in this box, and it's going to hang on for 120 days while it pitches and tosses and turns and bobs about, directionless as far as he knows. Now, of course, there wasn't a single moment there, but God was piloting that box. And God was guarding it very, very carefully. But it must have been a tremendous trial to Noah's faith. He was absolutely helpless. He was caught up in circumstances over which he had no control. And there are times in our own lives when, metaphorically, God shuts us in two. And when even those of us who are control freaks can do absolutely nothing about the unfolding sequence of events. If we are caught up, for example, in a terminal illness, our own or others, that's one of the terrifying things about it. You shut in. There's nothing you can do about it. You cannot cancel it. I remember at one time in my own life when events developed, and there was absolutely nothing I could do. You were shut in. And maybe for some of you too, it may have been like that, it may one day be like that. You are shut in. And we have no option but just to trust in God that this box that He's put us into is somehow under His control, although it certainly is not under our control. So there he is, bobbing about with his family on the surface of this tremendous flood, this tremendous depth of water. You're talking about ocean depth, something like 5 miles deep. Pacific, mid-Atlantic depths of water all over the earth. And all this has happened so suddenly. And it rises and rises until all the mountains are covered in the region. Madeira is covered. And then God, we're told in verse 1 of chapter 8, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and He sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. And now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky, and the water receded steadily. And this is one interesting technique that this writer uses, this part of the story. Tremendous repetition. He seems to want to say everything several times to drive the point home. And so the waters receded in verse 1. But he goes on to say, the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. And again the water receded steadily from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the water had gone down. So he's telling us again, and we're always saying, look, we heard you the first time. But he just wants to keep on telling you that this happened. And it conveys a sense almost of the gradualness, the relentless gradualness of it. The waters kept on going down. And he wants you to know that the waters kept on going down. And we all know how after 40 days Noah opened the window he had made in the ark, and he sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. And then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground, but the dove could find no place. The raven was probably happy enough scavenging about the carrion, but the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah the ark. And he reached out his hand. It's quite amazing that. Because, the whole earth is in a state of chaos. You are here in a situation of mega developments. And in the middle of it all, you have the hand stretched out to take in the dove. I think that's a brilliant storytelling. There's all this tremendous volume of water. There's this wind, perhaps of hurricane force, because it's going to evaporate all that water very, very quickly. And amid all the upheavals, Noah stretching out his hand for this dove. And part of the underlying, the subtext here actually, in the whole story is God's concern, not only for Noah, but for the animals, although they're defined as the animals which were with him. And the with him is very important, not least in terms of modern environmentalism, which doesn't like to be asked, whose environment is it anyway? We in the Highlands suffer so much from ecologists who have more regard for bogland than they have for the Highlanders, and we have to keep on asking, whose bogland do you think it is? Whose environment is it? Environment means it is environment to somebody. And these animals, they were with Noah. And it is beautiful there too in Genesis 8:1. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. It wasn't as if somehow they too mattered to God. And he had a concern for them as well. And I was thinking tonight, as someone who has not in the past had very much concern for the protection of threatened species, that because there are some species I don't feel all that keen to protect. But I've been maybe asking in the light of what we're told here, God is projected here in the context of this story as having a concern for every species. He literally wanted to conserve every species. All the animals, all the wild animals and the livestock. And God remembered them. In that box there are my creatures. There are human beings and an almost equal number of clean animals of each species and a pair of unclean animals in that box. The man I made is there, and the wild animals I made, they're there, and the domestic animals, they too are there. And God remembered not only the man, but God remembered the animals as well. And so God, again, in the excess of his omnipotence, causes the waters to recede. And Noah, in verse 10, waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. Now, when you go through the story at your leisure, one other fascinating detail is the attention that's paid to chronology. In verse 6, for example, I can't go through the whole story to prove this point, but in verse 6 we have after 40 days. And then in verse 10 he waited 7 more days, and so on. And time and again we have such detail. Again you see down in verse 13, by the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year. Very, very precise. And it's just again an interesting detail in the narrator's style, but it's also rooting this narrative very, very firmly in time, space, history. By the end of the first month of Noah's 601st year, that's when this particular little detail happened. The water had dried up from the earth. The flood was virtually over. Now, the dove had gone out, of course, and we see that in verse 10. He went 7 more days, and again sent out the dove from the ark. And when the dove returned to him in the evening, there in his beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. And of course, this has passed into universal human language, the dove and the olive branch. Even today, in the context of the Iraqi crisis, we talk of the hawks and the doves in the White House. And we speak of the olive branch, holding out the olive branch. And that's one instance of the impact of biblical language and metaphor on the whole of human discourse. But of course, the dove also occurs as a potent symbol in the story of the baptism of Christ. The Spirit of God descends like a dove upon him as he himself ascends out of the water. And it is, I'm sure, a deliberate link between the dove of Noah and the Holy Spirit, because the Noah's dove comes after God is satisfied that the judgment has been adequate, and the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost on the church in the context of the sacrifice of Christ. The dove as a symbol of peace, of reconciliation between God and man. And in the baptism story of Jesus, the Spirit coming in this visible form, I think sacramentally saying to Jesus that as a result of his life and ministry, there will be peace, as well as peace between God and Noah, symbolized by the dove at the time of the flood. And so, let's take it, the flood is over, and then look down there towards verse 20 of chapter 8, as we move into the final resolution, the denouement of this particular drama. And we're told that then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. And here is Noah. The crisis is over, and he is now moving into worship mode in response to the greatness and the goodness of God. And we're told that Noah built an altar to Yahweh, the Lord in block capitals. He built an altar to the Lord. And it is the first mention in the Bible of an altar. This is the first altar. Now, that will occur, of course, many other times, but this is the first altar. And Noah builds it here after the flood. And we're told, too, that Noah took some of all the clean animals and clean birds and sacrificed burnt offerings on this particular altar. Now, one of the interesting features here is the extravagance and generosity of Noah's sacrifice. Because his livestock at the end of the day didn't amount to very much in terms of the domestic animals which he had. He only had 7 of these animals. But the proportion of his stock which he sacrificed, one of every clean animal, it must have been a tremendous sacrifice. And I think that in that extravagance, it reflects Noah's own inner relief. Again, there is no description of any psychological kind as to Noah's state of mind. We have to deduce that from those objective data. But his instant reaction when he's on solid ground is to build an altar. And on that altar, to sacrifice probably dozens, hundreds of animals, clean animals of every kind were sacrificed by him. Now, it's a question just what the purpose of that sacrifice was, taking it as just one sacrifice. It probably had some propitiatory element, an element of appeasement, but I think that was minimal, because by this time God had assuaged his own anger against the corrupt world. And I think therefore that primarily, perhaps, it is a thank offering, sheer gratitude to God, that in the midst of this unutterable calamity, Noah's own life had been spared. And the relief after tossing on the tempestuous waters of the deluge for those months, now at last to be saved on dry land. And so here he is saying thank you to God from the very bottom of his heart. But I have also to note that it is described here as a burnt offering, as a holocaust. And the primary intent and significance of a holocaust, of course, is unqualified consecration and self-dedication. Because in the Holocaust, which is probably the most basic kind of sacrifice, the whole animal is utterly and totally consumed. Now, we have become familiar with the Holocaust concept or word very much in the context of the Nazi slaughter of the Jewish people in the Second World War. And I have no objection to doing all we can to highlight the unutterable gravity of the anti-Semitism that bred that particular calamity. But at the end of the day, it was not a Holocaust in the strict sense. It wasn't a liturgical act, of course, anyway, but some survived, although millions perished. But in the Holocaust, in the burnt offering, there was nothing left. And this is the utterance of Noah's heart. I am wholly yours. Now to be thine, yea, thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come. Wholly, totally, utterly God's, to use Paul's language, to spend and to be spent in God's service. Calvin's great motto, I offer my heart to you, O Lord. And here is Noah, this righteous man who had walked with God, and here he is after the flood. He is rededicating himself to God as a burnt offering. And the Lord, we are told, smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart. So it's not so much, of course, the smell of the sacrifice physically, but the inward piety of which those sacrifices were an expression. Just as when Paul in the prison at Rome gets the gift through Epaphroditus from the church at Philippi, he accepts it as an indication of the love towards himself. And he's at pains to say as tactfully as I can, the gift itself is very valuable, although I didn't quite altogether need it because God is supplying all my needs. But it is so important to me because it says to me that you people in Philippi, you love me. And that's how it is here. God really felt this pleasing aroma, this expression of gratitude and of self-dedication on the part of the human race. And then two great things happen. God promises that something will never happen again. And then God promises that something will keep on happening forever afterwards. First of all, something will never happen again. Never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And he's giving Noah this tremendous assurance, which he'll repeat later on, that never again will there be such a calamity on the earth. Never again will I curse the ground. Now, it doesn't mean that the curse that was pronounced by God on the ground after the fall has been revoked, but because the ground still bears thorns and thistles, the symptoms of that curse. But God is saying, I will never again bring this kind of calamities on the scale. I will never bring that upon the earth. God makes that unconditional promise. But it's also very interesting and to an extent perplexing, the reason that is alleged or adduced for this particular promise on God's part. The NIV has played with it a bit, although the footnote indicates that it is aware of the alternative. It says here, I won't curse the ground because of man, even though every thought of his heart is evil from childhood. And the margin tells us, for every thought of his heart is only evil from childhood. And I think that most would agree that the word here should be for. And the reason that it's adduced for never again cursing the ground is man's depravity. And the paradox is that that was also the reason for bringing the flood in the first place. Earlier on, God saw how corrupt the earth had become. And God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people. And way back earlier on, in chapter 6, in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination and thought of his heart was only evil all the time. So we have this tension here, and I'm not sure I can resolve this for you logically, that first of all, God sends a flood because of the state of the human heart. And then God says, I will never again send a flood just because of the state of the human heart. And it's almost as God is saying, I just have to live with the fact that this is the way these creatures are. Now, of course, the whole language is anthropomorphic. It is human language applied to God. But God is saying, this is the reality. And I cannot keep on, because if I pursue this policy, I'll need to wipe out every generation, time and time and time again. I'll need to keep on doing it, because this world will get no better at all, because every thought of the human heart is only evil from childhood. And so I will not ever again adopt this policy. Now, as I say, this is not the language of systematic theology or the language of academic discourse, but it is this great, vivid, populist language which God has chosen to use. And God is saying there really is no point in it, because I would need to keep on doing it all the time to wipe out every generation. Because here we are in the 21st century after Christ, and still we are as barbaric and as inhumane and as utterly ridiculous in our criminal folly as ever they were before the Christian era. No sign of improvement at all. We're still going to slaughter millions, and we don't know why. So this is made a great positive promise. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. This great variety and yet constancy of the seasons. There is seed time and there is harvest. There is cold and there is heat. There is summer and there is winter. There is day and there is night. Now obviously, during the flood, there had been none of these things. No seed time, no harvest, no sequence of cold and heat, but probably just cold all the time. No summer or winter, no day or night. And now God is saying from now on, those alternations will continue on earth. And yet it is also saying to us that that is not some kind of natural human right, or even some inevitable feature of the creation, but it's covenantal. God is promising us that the night that presently covers Falkirk will in the morning yield to the day, and that the winter will soon yield to the summer. But he is also saying this to us as long as the earth endures. And he's reminding us of the provisionality of it all and the reality of our final accountability. It's as if God is saying to us, I can't keep on sending floods on that earth. I will leave it all to the end. And at the end there'll be a reckoning. But as long as the earth endures, there'll be no more intermediate reckoning on the scale of the flood. But one day will come when earth's history is over and their story is finished, and then we'll have the reckoning. But up to that point God says, I will maintain the sequence. Now, it seems to me that that raises some very interesting and some very solemn questions. We know ourselves that we have the capability to inflict nuclear winter on the whole of this planet. And it is a very interesting question whether God is here saying that he will see to it that no agency, natural or human, is going to be able to interrupt this sequence as long as the earth endures. And maybe we are required to exercise a faith on a par with Noah's own faith, that God would do as he had said, and God would save him, and take aboard for ourselves this tremendous reassurance that God will not allow the sequence of seed time and harvest, of summer and winter, of day and night, ever to cease. And you can say, yes, but it just takes one madman to plunge the world into nuclear winter. Yes, and it only takes one God to restrain that madman, or a whole army of madmen. And of course it is so delicately balanced. And that's where faith has to be, without guarantees. There is no guarantee but that some madman or madmen will arise who have the capability and inclination to put an end to those alternations and sequences. But God is saying, every human heart is in my hand, and all human technology and its deployment is in my hand. So I think there is a biblical word here saying to us that we put our trust in God. And then we move into chapter 9, and we're told, then God blessed Noah and his sons. And we move here in chapter 9:1 to what are called the Noahic ordinances, ordinances that God imposed on Noah after the flood. And the Jews, the rabbinical Jews, were of the opinion, especially latterly, that it was by these ordinances that God would judge the Gentiles. And whereas there was the Torah for Israel, there were those Noahic ordinances for the Gentiles. And those Gentiles who kept those ordinances would know God's blessing. That was a Jewish point of view. What is interesting further is that in Acts 15, when the problem arose of the obligations of Gentile believers within the church, and the council met in Jerusalem to make a decision and form a policy on that question, that when they send out instructions to the churches, they do echo those Noahic ordinances to avoid idolatry and fornication and things strangled, and to abstain from blood. Well, if we look at what is happening here, what God says to Noah and his family after the flood, God blessed Noah and his sons. And he gave them certain mandates. One was, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Now, that, of course, is itself said in a psychological context where people might hesitate to bring children into this dreadful world, and where Noah and perhaps even more his sons and his family needed tremendous reassurance. And so God tells them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the whole earth. Don't be frightened to move away and to fill the whole earth. Now, what echoes there are? Earlier on, the earth had been filled with violence. Now you go and fill the earth with your own seed. But if you compare that mandate with the creation mandate in Genesis, there is a very interesting omission. And that is, there is no word here about subduing the earth and having dominion over it. But there is a procreation mandate. And God is saying to us, despite all the fears and all the ecological questions and crises, do not be afraid to bring children into this world. Be fruitful and multiply in number and fill the earth. And the second thing that emerges here, although it may seem subordinate, in some ways it is quite supreme, and that is the prohibition that is passed against the eating of blood. That occurs in verse 4, but you must not eat meat that has its life blood still in it. Now, that is said in a very, very interesting context, because God here specifically authorizes the eating of meat. Now, we don't know, in fact, whether men ate meat before the deluge. There is no prohibition or a vegetarian insistence in Genesis 1 and 2. But there was no specific mandate in Genesis 1 and 2 for the eating of meat. Now, before we rush into the instinctive belief, almost a sentimental belief that man and animals lived in such harm, the thought of eating them is quite impossible, we have to hesitate, because it may very well be that the implications for the human anatomy or the human physiology of suddenly becoming a meat-eating population, having been originally vegetarian, the implication may be pretty horrendous, and I'm not going to risk in the present company commenting on that. But we should not, in my view, rush to insist that man must have been vegetarian before the fall. But here there is a specific permission given to God. And he says in verse 3, everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. Now, apart from the mandating of eating meat, there is a very interesting detail here as well. There is nothing said of the distinction between clean and unclean foods. Oddly enough, that distinction has occurred in the narrative. There were 7 clean animals and only 2 unclean ones. But here, that distinction does not occur. And it's actually a very, very graphic and suggestive idea. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. And it's unlimited. Of course, we have our own tastes and our own predilections. And we might react with horror to the idea of eating some of the things that live and move. But if you go to the Northern Territory in Australia, you'd find them eating all kinds of things that move, all kinds of grubs and reptiles and so on. And obviously, the human system can cope perfectly well with these, as all members of the SAS would know as well, that you can survive on all kinds of strange creatures. But here there is nothing said of this distinction between clean and unclean animals. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. It is also, of course, indicated here that the fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, and so on, upon every living creature. In fact, is going to be afraid of man. And I think that that too is interesting, because it does indicate that the harmony which prevailed in paradise, and which will prevail perhaps in the world to come, based on the pictures of the wolf and the lamb cohabiting, that's gone. But the interesting thing here is not that man is going to be afraid of the animals, but they are going to be afraid of him. And I think that is something we ought to take on board, that whatever fears we have of some animals, almost every animal on earth is afraid of man. Now, that doesn't mean but that those animals, if threatened or attacked or starving, will not attack a man. But for the most part, they are afraid of a human being. And as you know, of course, almost every animal on earth can detect when the human being is frightened of it. And it is, I think, fairly certain that the animal finds that quite disturbing, and it makes the animal aggressive. But here anyway, God is saying, the fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air. And this again is by divine appointment. It is something that God himself is going to see to. So you may eat those animals. Those animals will be in fear and dread of you, but you must not eat meat that has its life blood still in it. A prohibition on eating of blood. Now, it's a moot point whether, in fact, that is still binding. It's probably safer to assume that it is. And we, of course, know today that life is so closely linked that blood is so closely linked to survival in many forms. Blood is also, of course, an extremely dangerous substance. But the argumentation here, I just want to leave this with you and hope you'll take it carefully. Meat that has its life blood in it, if we go back to, or if we could look at Leviticus 17, and I think it's verse 11, this same issue is taken up where there is a Levitical prohibition on eating blood. And the reason given is this. We all know the translation that the life of the soul is in the blood. But what Leviticus actually says is that the blood is the nephesh, is the soul of every animal. The blood is the soul of every animal. Now you can take that word nephesh or soul simply as life. The corresponding Greek word is psyche, from which comes the word psychology, and of course the Lord Jesus poured out his soul unto death. Now this does not remotely mean that in our sense the word animals of soul have souls, and by soul you mean spirit and intellect and imagination and so on. But that is not how the Bible uses those words, and it's saying to us here, you must not eat blood, because the blood is the soul of every animal. The blood is the life. There is something sacred here. Some commentators say that the important point here is that we were to be redeemed by the blood of the Son of God, and that made the blood precious. Well, I can't go with that because, of course, the whole body of Christ was sacred. It's not simply a matter of blood. But I don't know exactly where this is going to fit in. I think it is tremendously suggestive from a theological point of view to a physiological and biochemical point of view that the blood is the life of every animal. It is the soul of every animal. The life is there in the blood itself, and we're not allowed by God to consume that. And the other thing that arises here is God's insistence on the sanctity of human life and the safeguards that God enacts to surround and protect that sanctity for your lifeblood. Now he's saying to us, remember, I will hold you accountable, he said to Noah, for eating the lifeblood of an animal. You must not eat the blood of the animal. There is something in that blood that's quite special, and medical science knows that blood is special. So you must not eat that blood. And if anyone sheds your blood, I will hold that shedder of blood accountable. And he says that he will do so. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And in the Levitical law, any animal that killed a man or a human being, that animal's life was forfeit. And he is saying too, the same applies in this economy. From each man too, I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. And if somebody sheds the blood of a human being, then God says, I will demand an accounting. And he lays down, with regard to Noah, this provision, that whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man. Now the argument is moved there. He does not say, if you shed the blood of a man, there'll be a reckoning, because the blood is the soul of the human being. But it is elevated to this because in the image of God has God made man. Now, I am not myself convinced that this is itself a mandate for capital punishment, if only because I don't like to see doctrines based on one text. And I don't think that I would feel warranted in asserting on this basis that there is a biblical directive or a biblical warrant for capital punishment, especially in a judicial system, which depends often on circumstantial and indirect evidence. And the deterrence argument is immoral. We have to have a specific and crystal clear divine warrant. Now, I'm not saying but that sometimes may be such a warrant, but I would not like to see this reenacted, and I would not like to see it reenacted, especially on the fundamentalist basis that there is this text that says that it must be done. There are other biblical instances where the capital punishment or sentence is enacted or sanctioned for Sabbath breaking, for adultery, and so on. These have been revoked specifically by the New Testament, and I think that it is safer for us to leave that kind of ultimate sanction to God, if only because our human justice system is so manifestly precarious. But I don't expect anybody here to agree with me on that. But that is how I feel. I'm not prepared to have that. I don't regard one text as sufficient warrant for me to take the life of another human being, even as part of a judicial process. I would need to be absolutely crystal clear. Now, that, of course, also applies to the whole range of judicial options and sanctions. A magistrate has no right to impose any sentence that God himself does not warrant. But here was this, the divine sanction protecting the sanctity of human life. Now, I thought this wouldn't last a huge lot, maybe 20 minutes or so tonight at 6:10, but it's time I was stopping it anyway. The final movements, God establishing his covenant, and the scene with Noah at the close. Now, the covenant really simply reenacts what we've seen at the end of chapter 8. Again, God is saying that he's going to ensure the perpetuity of the present order of creation. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life, verse 15. If you want to analyze it, the covenant passage from verse 8 down to verse 16 has these features. First of all, who the parties are. I now establish my covenant, verse 8, God says, with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you. Now notice the with you. And notice again how comprehensive it is, every species. I will establish my covenant with you and with every species. And you see again how repetitious this section comes, how it itemizes the various creatures. In verse 12 again, between you and every living creature, and so on and so forth. So the parties are God on the one side, all living creatures on the other. And then there is a promise. The promise is given, never again, verse 15, will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Never again will that happen. That is God's great covenant promise. And then there is the covenant sign, the rainbow. And of course, I think the rainbow existed before this, but it's now given this particular function. It is a sign of God's covenant. And I think it's very beautiful because it's such a contrast. Again, if you go back into the upheavals and the chaos of the deluge itself, and then the beauty and the serenity and the totally unthreatening nature of the rainbow. And that's such a contrast with all the horrors that have gone before. But it's important to notice too that the rainbow is not a sign for us. It does not say to us, you will see the rainbow and you'll remember the covenant. Although at one time in Germany, I gather, there was a practice among the pious in Germany that whenever there was a rainbow, the children were asked to recite the Lord's Prayer. And although that can become, of course, pure formality, there is still a certain beauty in it. That when there was a rainbow, they would think instantly of God. But in the narrative, it is God saying, I will see the covenant, and I will remember. I will see it and remember, he says in verse 16. I will see it. That rainbow, a reminder, a memorial to God of the pledge. Now, you see, whenever these people saw a drop of rain, they thought, another flood. They couldn't but think that way. But of course, from the rain came the rainbow came. And God was saying, they would think of the rainbow, of course, but he was saying, remember, I will see the rainbow. And when you see it, remember that I'm seeing, and remember that I promised you that there may be raindrops, there may be showers and drizzles, there may be torrential rainstorms, but there will never again be a flood to destroy all life upon the face of the earth. What is not said here explicitly, of course, is how utterly asymmetrical that covenant is. You see, ordinarily a covenant will tell you who the parties are, what the promise is, and what the stipulations are. There are no stipulations here. The word for covenant in the Bible is used in everyday commerce in the ancient East for a contract between two businessmen or a treaty between two nations, and those are the results of negotiation and so on and so forth between the different parties. But here is an imposition. God says, this is how it's going to be. There is no negotiation, no discussion, no agreement, because this is not a pact between two equals, but it is a divine disposition, God in His sovereignty telling us how it is going to be. And I think that part of the beauty of it is that it's going to be regardless of how we behave. We have done awful things since God said this to Noah. We have once again filled the earth, every continent on earth, with violence. We have despoiled the environment, murdered God's creatures, slaughtered each other by the billion. And yet God has not gone back. We have been guilty of eating blood. We've been guilty of taking human life. And still God has not sent the flood. Because it is His own sovereign disposition. This is how it is going to be. I don't want to say much about Noah's drunkenness, except that we must limit the implications of the curse. It is limited, of course, to Ham, not to, and even within Ham's family, it is limited to Cain and cursed Canaan. And unfortunately, during apartheid, this was extended to all the Sethites, Shemites in the world, as if somehow those descendants of Ham in Africa and so on were all under the same curse as Cain, which was not at all true. But in many ways, what I wanted to look at as I close is the language of verse 28, and again, this brilliant storytelling. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Altogether, Noah lived 950 years, and then he died. And it doesn't matter how long we live. That's where the story is always going to end. I often wonder how bored was Noah with the rest of his life, those 350 years. We're not told because his feelings aren't part of the story. But certainly he never again lived what he had lived through when he was only 600 years old. But then, having lived all those centuries, nevertheless, then he died. Well, I shall stop there, and if we wanted to raise a few, to make some observations preferably, I'd be quite happy to receive them.